since October 7th, Israel has gradually destroyed the health system in Gaza. Dozens of hospitals have been shut down. There was the Al Ali hospital massacre on October 17th, where like Israel bombed a hospital where displaced Gazans were sheltering, and there was like disputed causality or responsibility, but clearly that's the case. More than 100 medical facilities are out of service. They bombed ambulances and killed medical workers. And like on top of all that carnage, the international community has warned that like an epidemic wave could be happening too. So like it's devastating, but I wondered if you could just like express to people how costly it is for this bombardment to attack specifically the providing of medical care.
Well, I'd like to start off by pointing out that Israel has always targeted hospitals and schools, as a matter of fact. I did a little research. Israel not only targeted schools in Palestine, Israel also targeted schools in Lebanon. So in 1996, Israel bombed a UNIFIL school where around, I don't know, don't quote me on the number, maybe around 100 children were killed. In 1970, Israel bombed an elementary school in Egypt, also under the pretext that terrorists were hiding there. And hospitals also have been bombed. This was documented by my friend Mike Lutz when he was working here in Palestine. So the bombing of schools and hospitals, this is not new. And because Israel has been attacking civilians for so long, the need for hospitals and good infrastructure for hospitals has been extremely important. That's one point. Second point is Gazans cannot leave Gaza with ease because Israel controls who goes in and who goes out, what goes in and what goes out as well. So Gazans had to build their own hospitals with all the facilities in order to be able to provide for the people of Gaza. Of course, from the names that are of these hospitals, so it's the Indonesian hospital, which means that most of the donations came from Indonesia. Al Ahli Hospital, this was funded by a church, by the Baptist Church. So most of these hospitals were donations. And this is where I ask, why aren't the donors mad and upset? Just a month ago, there was this village in southern Palestine, in southern West Bank. It was under attack by Israeli settlers that were supported by the Israeli army, and they dismantled the school that was in that village, in Masafer Yatta, as a matter of fact. And this school was built by funds from the European Union, and it had this card where it said, this place was funded by the European Union. So I'm just wondering, why doesn't the European Union hold Israel for what they're doing? I mean, they're taking apart the school, and this was done by European funded money.
I've heard, Judith Butler, who's a well-known American like academic philosopher and Jewish voice for peace, has talked with me about this on the podcast, that the repeated destruction of Gaza is also kind of horrifyingly itself like an industry, right? Like that,
Exactly.
Gaza has been reduced to rubble yet again, and will be rebuilt with this kind of international funding. Why is it the case that, Naomi Klein and others would say it's just disaster capitalism, that it's actually like a certain level of, to speak cynically, like almost like opportunistic investment in rebuilding from destruction again and again? That's a horrifying element of it, that the infrastructure being destroyed is in a certain sense good for parts of the global economy that develop, that, you know what I mean, like that benefit from being able to invest in that rebuilding.
Well said, Scott. And you also lead me to the next thought, which is Israel manufactures weapons that have been tried and tested on civilians, on Palestinians. So in the last attack on the hospital, when Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitte was still there, he described wounds he had never seen before, like where the flesh is cut up, but not on the areas that are weak, such as in the joints. So it was like in the middle of the arm or in the middle of the thigh, as if there's like this sharp razor blade that just cuts through the flesh. And this is a new form of weapon that he had never seen before. The types of burns that he saw on the children, it was like he had never seen this type of burns before. So the kinds of weapons that Israel was using on the people in Gaza was like a testing ground. So when they sell their weapons, it's actually tried and tested. Same thing goes for drones that they use to disperse demonstrators. They have built drones that are strong enough to carry 4 tear gas canisters that are fired into the people. One of my friends took part. She's not the youngest, so she took part. She used to take part in the first Intifada, which was in the early 80s. And she said that this tear gas burns inside your ears and inside your nose like never before, and nothing you do can help to stop this burning. So even things that are not lethal, they are also trying them and testing them on the demonstrators in the West Bank. So it's not just only the industry is profiting from the destruction of Gaza, it's also the industry, the war industry is profiting from killing the people of Gaza.
Yeah, it's this despicable laboratory for like dehumanization, it feels like. And you know, yeah, like this is sort of it feels like the difference this time is the obviousness of the genocidal nature of the violence. You know, the use of the term genocide to describe what Israel is doing is still somehow controversial in some parts, like of the West especially. But like there have been clear statements by Israeli ministers that, you know, just outline quite explicitly that this is in a very real sense the goal. And it sounds like, I mean, these forms of violence really are like predicated on dehumanizing the so-called enemy, which is this concentration of people that you've rendered into you know, bare life, you know, life somehow not worth living. Can you, I mean, can you give us a sense, I guess, because like there is no question in my mind that this constitutes genocide, but it's somehow still disputed. Can you sort of give us a sense of whether you see resistance to the campaign of genocidal violence at all within like Israel, for example, or these blocks of power where, you know, we're supposed to assume that there's somehow like univocal, universal support? I mean, you know, there are certainly Jews who are calling for peace, who are stating unequivocally that their Jewishness is not dependent on the destruction of Palestine and Palestinian life. Are you able to find solidarity, I guess, with Jewish people, for example, who are anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist?
Okay, wow, there's a lot to unpack here, Scott. So let me start with, first of all, I mean, there is solidarity all over the world, from grassroots levels to Jewish Voices for Peace to Code Pink. They've always been vocal about supporting Palestine. But I think this time it's different because the genocide is being broadcast live across the social media platforms. I mean, like there are these young journalists that are showing us what is going on in real time, and people are recording this and they're being moved. For example, so many people were like transformed to become pro-Palestinian once they saw the video of the father carrying what was left of his children in plastic bags. I mean, like, I think that was mind-blowing. Or the recent video of that father cuddling the daughter with the 2 bunny. Did you see that video? where
Yeah.
he was just holding her, and I think that was transforming for many people. I hope that this has changed people, let's say, in quotes, beyond repair, that they will always be pro-Palestinian and never change their mind, because the plight of Palestinian people is just. I mean, okay, Israel is backed by the Israeli lobby, and the Israeli lobby has very strong ties with Western media. And thus the media will use the narrative that is dictated by the Israeli lobby. They will use these words, they will use clashes, incursion, in order to gloss over the horrific facts that Israel is actually doing on the ground. They will dehumanize Palestinian lives. BBC just 2 weeks ago, as a matter of fact, brought this headline where so and so many Israelis were killed and so many Palestinians died. So
Right.
Palestinians die and Israelis are killed. And then there are these interviews on Fox News where they bring the families of Israelis who were killed. And then, you know, what they liked and how they loved and what their characters were like. And Palestinians are just numbers. So this media just pushes in the direction of dehumanizing Palestinians. And actually, Israeli leaders said it out loud on TV. Palestinians are the sons of the darkness. Palestinians are human animals.
Yeah.
And I do hope that this is taken to court, and that they should mark their words and be careful about what they say.
It should matter. I mean, it should matter. It ought to have implications within international law. Being just so explicit about this like annihilationist policy, you know, that should have repercussions. And yet, you know, it still is the case, I think, that what you describe, which is the kind of rendering of Palestinians into just like mere numbers, serves in many ways this like campaign of like genocidal violence. Israel is still disputing the number of dead, but nonetheless, like the numbers don't lie. Like 1 in 200 Palestinians have been Gazans have been killed. 4 in 5 have been displaced, right? So I mean, there's this attempt by Israel to just like vehemently deny the material reality on the ground, and the suffering that they're causing. Do you feel like it is part of just a kind of propaganda campaign to do that? Is it that straightforward? And do you think that propaganda campaign of just like denying and disputing is faltering in the world, at least outside of Israel?
Well, definitely the tide is changing, and there are cracks in the whole story of Israel being the only self-proclaimed democracy in the Middle East. The cracks are showing in the inconsistency of Israeli standards. So people know, they now know of the unjust laws that are the basis of the state of Israel. So, for example, in 2018, Israel approved a law that is called the nation state law. It has three major terms. The first one is that self-determination is only the right of Jews in Israel. Number two, building settlements is a fundamental basis of Israel. And number three, Hebrew is the only official language of Israel, and this instantly renders Arabic to a sort of quote unquote special status. Although 20%, over 20% of the people living in the state of Israel speak Arabic. So the whole the whole basis upon which Israel was founded is starting to reveal to the world how racist it actually is. And anyway, Israel was based on denying and lying. So we could start off as early as the early 1940s. Palestine was a barren land with no culture. That's not true.
Right.
Palestine was without people, for people without land. Palestinians have been around for hundreds of years. When the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte was assassinated, Israel denied, and then turns out they admitted it. Okay, we, the Stern the terrorist group, they assassinated him. So Israel has a very long history in lying and denying acts of terror that they have done. So it's not surprising that they now also deny perpetuating this genocide.
Yeah. And, to gesture back to what you're saying, like the reason why you have countries like the United States and Canada aligning still with Israel is that fact of being founded in the same kind of settler colonial violence. I think you're right to like point to that and say like these nations constitute these sort of a history of creating what Benedict Anderson called an imagined community around really like being accomplices to this like original violence, and in fact in the case of these nations, like a continued violence, and part of that violence, as you just said, is like saying there was nothing here before, that it was terra nullius, there was nothing here. And so yeah, like here in the country currently called Canada, we have an Indigenous activist and author named Leanne Bedasamosaki Simpson.
Yes, yeah.
Who's brilliant and who talks about like various forms of Indigenous resistance in the country. She went on the Red Nation podcast and talked about how like October 7th
Yes.
showed in some ways that Israel, despite being an oppressive colonial power that like maintains this apartheid regime through military force and this kind of carceral infrastructure,
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
they're not invulnerable, right?
Yeah.
And Michael Hart kind of said the same thing, that October 7th could be thought of as like a prison rebellion, in a sense. So like it's clear obviously that October 7th radicalized Benjamin Netanyahu's already like ultra far right government, has
Yes.
allowed his government to adopt this strategy of annihilation and displacement
Yeah.
against Palestine. But would you like, this is a tough question, I suppose, but would you say that the attack by Hamas galvanized Palestinians at all,
Mhm.
or was it mostly met with like other kinds of political, ethical, and like emotional responses?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that describing what happened in Gaza, that it is a prison rebellion, I think it's a very descriptive term. And also calling Gaza a prison, I think, is unjust. I'm going to quote Norman Finkelstein in his latest interview with Piers Morgan. It is a concentration camp.
Okay.
Israel has turned Gaza into a ghetto.
Okay.
You see, it started in 2005 when Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza. Israel maintained a very tight grip on the borders of Gaza, controlling who went in, who went out, and what went in and what went out. When in 2006, the elections did not go according to Israel's plan, Israel decided to turn this grip into a full-blown siege.
Mm.
Dov Weissglass, back then the advisor to the prime minister of Israel, said that they will put the people of Gaza on a strict diet, but they will not let them die of hunger. So this just gives you an idea of how condescending and how demeaning the Israel government looks at the Palestinians. So, and I don't think that what happened in early October, that it radicalized Netanyahu's government, because it was already extremely radicalized. For example, Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, he wrote in 2017 an article where he gave the Palestinians of the West Bank three options. One, they're allowed to immigrate leave their life, their land, their house, everything behind and just leave. Option B, they can accept to settle under Israeli law as second-degree citizens. And their third option is to die. And that was in 2017.
Right.
Itamar Ben Gvir, who was not drafted in the army because of his extremist views, and now he is a minister with Netanyahu's government. He said earlier this year, before the start of what happened in October, he said that his right to move inside the West Bank was more important than the right of Palestinians to move. So I don't think that the government of Netanyahu was waiting for anything in order to become more radicalized.
That's a
But
good point.
did what happened galvanize the Palestinians? Oh, yes, it definitely did. It galvanized the people all over the world. I mean, like every corner of the world was calling out for the justice of Palestinians. I mean, this is, I never saw this coming, honestly.
Right.
So the social media has become the voice of those who have been brushed aside and silenced for so long.
Yeah, I mean, that's a powerful statement, and it shouldn't be controversial to say that that's true. You know, that's just the kind of political reality that exists. And that political reality has a lot to do, I think, with, as you say, like media, communication, like how reality is shaped in people's minds by mediation and representation. And so, you know, I guess I wanted to ask you the question of like, from your perspective, who is speaking for Palestine and for Palestinians right now? You know, you've got this huge spike in aggression, as you rightly point out, not necessarily like a radicalization, maybe an escalation, but not a radicalization of that government. Since then, that kind of moment of October 7th, there has been obviously massive protests, but there seems to be this kind of like a really distressing petering out of concern within Western media, you know, even as the violence continues. And I wondered if you could share your thoughts on whether like the lack of Palestinian voices in the media conversation is maybe contributing to this cycle where like Israel is permitted to use the actions of Hamas as this justification for its campaign of destruction. Do you think that exclusion of Palestinians from the picture, as it were, is part of the perpetuation of the violence?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So let me start by saying that based on the fact that we know that Western media is controlled by the Israeli lobby. Robert Fisk wrote about this, John Mersheimer, Chris Hedges. This has been documented. Mm-hmm. So by default, the Israeli narrative will be pushed forward and it will be glossed over, and Palestinian voices will be silenced or brought up very rarely and just in brief instances, and the whole picture will not be drawn clearly for the Western media, for the Western audience to understand the full picture. That's number one. Number two, when the Palestinian voices are brought forward, they are usually attacked by anti-Palestinian figures, and they're not given the chance to voice their opinion and the facts properly. Mm-hmm. Now, with regard to your question, who speaks for Palestine? Unfortunately, there has been a split between the leadership in the West Bank and the leadership in Gaza. But the voices in Palestine are calling for a united leadership that will prepare the ground for elections that have been postponed for much too long. And hopefully, these elections will produce a leadership that will speak for Palestine and the Palestinian rights and pave the way for justice for Palestinians.
There's clearly a lot of like I hear a lot of hope in your voice in terms of like the promises of democracy. But you know, on that point, you know, I was reading Perry Anderson's a long article, The House of Zion, where he talks
Mhm.
about, like how the tragedy, people often refer to like the tragedy of Palestine, which I think you would sort of push back against on some level, like, and say like it's the term you use, for example, that it's unjust, right, to talk about the tragedy. But his claim is that the tragedy of Palestine's position is that it's kind of stranded in the so-called Arab world, where he writes, Palestinian democracy is unlikely in a sea of despotism, right? In
Yeah.
other words,
Mhm.
Palestine can't survive as a democratic state because none of its potential allies are democracies. And he
Mhm.
says that Israel is not going to stop until it is, quote, confronted with a real threat in the Middle East. There are also people like Noam Chomsky who argue that the real tragedy is that because Palestine doesn't have significant wealth or power, a lot of the world doesn't regard it as worth worrying about, basically.
Mhm.
Both of these arguments feel unjust to me, like, and ignore
Yeah.
the roots of the violence in racism to some extent. Like that's my reading anyway. But I'm wondering, what you think they might not understand about the situation, maybe what you think they get right, I don't know. But like, where's Palestine positioned in relation to these bigger geopolitical and like economic forces?
This is a very important question, Scott. First of all, I'd like to disagree with Perry.
Mm-hmm.
Arabs did not abandon Palestine. Their governments may have gone for normalization, but the people, Israel can try as hard as they want, but they have not broken through to the people in the Arab countries,
Hmm.
hands down. And I also don't think that Palestine cannot establish a democratic country because their allies are so-called undemocratic. I think there are many other factors that play against Palestinians being able to establish a country to start off with. But I think that Noam Chomsky got it right. Um, Palestine is not a country of wealth, like you said, and that's why it might not be as important to the West.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really sad that humanity is measured by the importance and the wealth of certain countries.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that Israel was established by the West in the Middle East in order to establish an ally right there where the old Silk Road was,
Mm-hmm.
and an ally for the West, which is close to the Suez Canal. And this is the strength of Israel. It is geopolitically located in a very sensitive area, which is important to the West. Biden once said that Israel is a very useful country, and if it hadn't been created, he would have created an Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But all that aside, in the end, Palestinians have the higher moral ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that eventually this is where things will boil down to.
Yeah, I hope, like, I share this sense that it must be that must be true, right? That history must bend toward justice. This is it's a hard thing to insist upon in this current moment of so much sort of cynicism and fatalism, that these great powers, that have amassed so much military might, will just go on indefinitely, controlling the like fate of the globe. But this is something that Maca Gomez Barris told me recently on the podcast, that it's not just Gaza. It's really a battle for like the planet that we're talking
Yeah,
about, you
yes.
know?
I recently read a wonderful tweet that says people who chant for the justice for Palestine also chant for the justice in Congo, in Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the plight of all oppressed people. And I thought that was wonderful because
Yeah, yeah.
in order to have freedom for one oppressed people, we have to think of all the oppressed people.
Yeah, and it's absolutely true. And like, you think about somebody like Greta Thunberg, maybe the world's most famous climate activist, being sort of spurned by German, in particular, German climate activists for saying no climate action on occupied land. Like that's all she said was no, there's no climate action on occupied land. The book, there's a book called Palestine Speaks that I've been reading. And,
Yes.
it starts with the statement that, quote, hope flourishes right alongside stark cynicism and despair in Palestine. Um, but
That's right.
that there is, of course, a feeling of insecurity that permeates nearly every facet of Palestinian society.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I already get a sense of where you situate yourself on the spectrum of like hope and insecurity. But because of the kind of work that you do, I wanted to ask, like, whether it does shift day to day, depending on what you face and kind of what keeps you going in the work that you do.
Well, I am a gum surgeon and I teach at Al Quds University, the dental school there. In order to reach Abu Dis, where the university is situated, I have to drive outside Ramallah. I have to go through a military checkpoint. Sometimes this checkpoint is closed, so I have to circumvent this checkpoint by driving through villages and through dirt roads. And then, of course, it becomes a very long way. But I keep myself hopeful through listening to podcasts. So you get new ideas and you keep yourself away from thinking, the negative thoughts. Is it worth it? Should I keep doing this? Why am I doing this? But the other day, I had a discussion with my 16-year-old. She had seen a girl her age weeping over the body of her mother, and of course that really cut deep. And then she asked me, Mom, why did you have me here in Palestine? Why can't we just live somewhere else? Why was I born into this obligation to speak for Palestine? So I said, the difference between humans and animals is that we all eat and reproduce and sleep, but humans have a cause to fight for. So even if we were living outside Palestine, I would demand of you and ask of you to have a cause that you're fighting for, whether it's against the ozone, the destruction of the ozone layer, whether it's for animal shelters, whether it's for children with disabilities. But every person has to have a cause that you devote some time to defend and protect. And I think that as Palestinians, we have the moral obligation to stay positive and keep going. Because in the end, I mean, history has shown that every nation will rise and then eventually fall. And in the meantime, we have to stay strong, positive, educated, and educate those around us. So this is really what keeps me going. When I go to university, I also talk to my students, and you hear these stories of resilience and strength where I have students whose parents are farmers who have herds of sheep, and how the mother milks the sheep in the morning and then sells the milk in order to be able to provide for her daughter in order to go to school, to go to dental school. So it's all these little stories that give you hope and keep you going.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely incredible. And has left me a little speechless. I'm really interested to hear about like the work that you do in more detail. And I think people need to understand life in Palestine. Your daughter thinking about like, what does it mean for me to be born here and have to speak for, the people that I care about, my community. Those are the things that I think perform the important work of like humanizing folks there. You know, Edward Said, the Palestinian activist and author,
Yeah,
talked a lot about how like the predominant mood of the so-called Arab world is of course secular, right? Like, so the kind of Orientalist projection that the West does, it's like so
that's
unjust.
that's very
So in the West Bank, you face, as you described, like this policed mobility. There are more than
Mhm.
500 checkpoints and roadblocks.
That's very
Um, you know, this is something that I don't think people can necessarily wrap their heads around until they like live it or see it.
yeah.
So I just, wondered if you could go into more detail at all about like what a typical day is like for you, if you wanted to provide any more around that. And I suppose in terms of like the comparison between this moment of like
Mhm.
violent attack, not incursion, but a violent attack, how is that different from the everyday life of occupation otherwise?
So for starters, I'm a working mom, just like
Right.
around the world. I nag in the morning so that the girls get ready in time for school. And in the afternoon, I am driving them around to their after school activities. So it's flute for one girl, piano for the other. And then there is swimming training for one girl and karate training for the other. It's just like any family around the world. It is just upon moving outside Ramallah that the scenery changes. You see, Ramallah, where I live, is, according to the Oslo Agreement, so-called Area A. This means that Israel has no right to enter these areas. Nonetheless, Israel does perform raids, or according to their terminology, incursions, where they go inside into Ramallah and they arrest Palestinians. They take them usually at night, blindfolded and usually barefoot, and they don't notify their family members where they're taking them from. They also invade organizations and confiscate their material and their equipment. So just a few weeks ago, they raided the room of the the student council at Birzeit University. They just barged into their room, they confiscated their laptops and all the reading material that these students had stored inside the university. So this is the norm
Mm-hmm.
in Ramallah. But this is not even the worst part. Other parts in the West Bank, they feel the real brunt of the Israeli occupation. So there are these villages in the southern part of West Bank, for example, Masafir Yatta. They have had daily attacks by Israeli settlers that are protected by the Israeli army. And there are also the refugee camps where there are every night there are raids by the Israeli army into that camp where they arrest people, take them and uh, into the Israeli military courts.
Mm-hmm.
So in the cities per se, we just have our normal life. Like
Mm-hmm.
any, we have restaurants, we have cafes, we come and go as we please. But once we want to move outside the city, it is severely restricted.
Right.
And like you said, the West Bank is riddled with roadblocks and checkpoints that really control our movement.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been able to reach the university since early October.
You touched on something that leads me to kind of ask this again, like obviously difficult question, but like I just want to kind of
Sure.
underline the thing that you're saying that the point is when it comes to like freedom,
Yeah.
the point of achieving Palestinian liberation is so that people can just like go about their day. But yeah, it was reported by the Guardian that Hamas tried to negotiate a transfer of hostages, right?
That, that's
Uh,
correct.
with Netanyahu's government in exchange for just like stopping the bombardment, right? Ceasing hostilities.
Yeah.
He apparently rejected that deal and just
Mm.
like decided instead to carry out this campaign of terror. Um, So, you mentioned that Israel will just like raid and extrajudiciously, let's say, like, take hostages themselves. I wondered if you could kind of help listeners understand how hostages in this current moment are being used for the purpose of carrying out this violent campaign. I mean, and also if you could speak to just like how like concern over the well-being and freedom of hostages is being used by Israel, why the world doesn't seem to care in the same way about the many people who are imprisoned by the state of Israel.
Okay, so let me start off by telling the listeners that before the beginning of October, there were around 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails. And for those who do not know, Palestinians are kept in military jails, and they are tried in military courts and judged by military officers. So the whole setup is already going straight towards prohibiting Palestinians from getting fair and just trials. Mm-hmm. I have a very recent and very raw experience that I'd like to share with you and the listeners. Last year, a colleague of my daughter was arrested from his house. Shadi Khouri was 16 when he was taken from his parents' house in East Jerusalem. Shadi Khouri is a Christian Palestinian. And I'm intentionally mentioning his religion right here because sometimes the media tries to portray the ongoing aggression of Israel against the Palestinians as if it's a clash of religions, and that is not true. Christian Palestinians suffered just as much at the hand of Israeli oppression, just as much as Muslim Palestinians. So now the 16-year-old boy was taken from his home in the middle of the night. He was beaten on his face and he bled. The photos that were shared by his parents show the trail of blood from his room all the way down to the street, where he was taken barefoot without notifying his parents where he was taken. And he was interrogated without the presence of neither his parents nor his lawyer. Of course, his room was literally turned upside down. The closet was completely thrown on the floor. His desk was trashed. So, I mean, Shadi was lucky. After 40 days without trial, he was sent home and sentenced to home arrest. And he had to spend the rest of the year at home. He couldn't reach school. Unfortunately, other children are not as lucky as Shadi. For example, Ahmed Manasra was 13 years old when he was involved in a stabbing incident. Right then, he was run over by an Israeli settler. And there are videos that went viral of this 13-year-old boy lying bleeding on the ground, being taunted by Israeli settlers. Then Ahmad was dragged with his bandages still on, dragged to court. Now, this is a very important point. His trial was postponed again and again and again until he turned 15. Why is that? Because according to Israeli law, Palestinians are treated like adults once they reach the age of 15. Then, so when he turned 15, Ahmed Manasra was sentenced to solitary confinement. Now, Ahmed is 21 years old and he suffers from schizophrenia due to the harsh treatment by the Israeli military courts. These are two examples of children in Israeli jails. It's worth mentioning as well that from these 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners, there are around 1,000 that undergo something that is called administrative detention. Administrative detention is when Israel arrests Palestinians and puts them in jail and does not charge them or take them to court. So they are held without any charge. And this administrative detention can be renewed indefinitely for 6 months in one shot it can be renewed indefinitely. Many Palestinians protest this administrative detention by going on hunger strikes.
Right.
And this summer, one Palestinian actually died after 86 days of hunger strike.
86 days.
86 days of hunger strike protesting his detention.
Right.
Now, you asked about the well-being of the Israeli hostages. Actually, there was a video that was not shown by the BBC. It was cut short. It showed in the beginning of the aggression on Gaza, 2 old ladies were set free. They were returned to Israel. And once they were handed over to the Israeli military, they turned around to shake hands with their Palestinian captors. Also, Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who was taken in 2005, he also spoke about how his captors played chess and checkers with him. So you can see the stark contrast. The question is, why doesn't the world care so much about the Palestinian prisoners? Well, like we said, and like you said as well, Scott, the Western media is pro-Israel. They don't bring the voices of the Palestinians in their day-to-day news. But I do believe that things are changing with Generation Z taking over the social media platform and voicing the voice of those who have been brushed aside for so long.
And I think, you know, one of the things that seems to use this term, like radicalized younger generations in support of Palestinian liberation is the just overwhelming fact of like violence against children. I mean, like I mean, the numbers are unbelievable. And it's not numbers, it's lives, it's neighborhoods destroyed, right? You're talking about more than 12,000 people killed since October 7th, but thousands and thousands of children who have done absolutely nothing, who, you know, it's abhorrent. It's telling that Israel wants to dispute this number because it knows that it's like abhorrent on its face, that there's no disputing how awful it is. Arundhati Roy, the anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist author.
Arundhati, yes.
She wrote this really powerful piece recently where she says, the solution cannot be a militaristic one. It can only be a political one in which Israelis and Palestinians live together or side by side in dignity with equal rights. The world must intervene. The occupation must end.
Very true.
Like that just puts it that is not complicated. That should not be complicated. But the question that I think is still complicated because it's about what is going to happen is, you know, how can Palestine be free if a two-state solution, so-called, is not possible any longer because of Israel's clear unwillingness to accept it, to give up any sovereignty in the region, right? You talked about the writing into law of self-determination, settlement, and Hebrew as the national language. You know,
exactly.
How can Palestine become a state? Can it be a state like other states? What does autonomy look like in Palestine, and how can it be achieved?
Palestinians don't want autonomy. Palestinians want the right to self-determination. They want political rights. They want a country with clear borders. That's what they want. The global community must step in and take responsibility for the terror that they are supporting, either directly or indirectly by staying silent. Less than 2 months ago, Netanyahu held up a map in front of everyone at the UN General Assembly. And this map completely ignored the presence of Palestinians. And in his speech, he didn't even mention Palestinians. So any talk of a two-state solution is merely a tactic to divert from the reality on the ground. How can Palestine be free? I don't know. I'm not a politician. But what I do know is that this oppression cannot go on like this. And the people who perpetrate it must be held accountable. his Palestinian historians writing about Palestine. We have Palestinian musicians writing songs about Palestine. Palestinians in the diaspora ferociously proud of their grandmother's Palestinian food. There are Palestinian women holding online courses teaching Palestinian embroidery. And this gives me hope. People still call their daughters Jaffa and Caesarea, which are the villages their grandparents were kicked out of. Mm. And this has been going on for decades. Golda Meir once said, "The old Palestinians will die and the young will forget." I know that she is mistaken.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And, you know, what I'm so grateful for is that like you're sharing this kind of cumulative knowledge of like experiencing this occupation directly and just saying like that it cannot go on. It cannot go on like this. That refusal I find so, yeah, so inspiring. So I really appreciate you making the time to talk to me today. I know that you're juggling all kinds of things. So thanks so much.
No, thank you, Scott. I mean, like, this was really, I really had to go deep and think and gather my thoughts.